Relative pronouns, what are they? Well, a relative pronoun introduces a relative clause. A relative pronoun is a DMW. A relative pronoun is very similar to an interrogative pronoun. And who, whom, which, that, whose are all relative pronouns. So let's expand on each of these. First of all, we said that a relative pronoun introduces a relative clause. So what is a relative clause? Well, let's recall that a clause has its own subject and verb, while a phrase does not. So first, be able to distinguish between a clause and a phrase. A dependent clause can function one of three ways: as an adverb, as an adjective, or substantively. In other words, it can be an adverb, in which case it modifies another verb. It can be an adjective, in which case it modifies a noun. Or it can be a substantive, which means it's performing one of the noun functions. Now, a relative clause is referring specifically then to a dependent clause that is functioning adjectively. It's called a relative clause because it begins with a relative pronoun. So this is what a DMW is. A DMW stands for dependent marker word, and a relative pronoun is a dependent marker word. That means it marks the beginning of a dependent clause. You'll also remember that subordinating conjunctions are dependent marker words. In fact, there are two kinds of dependent marker words: relative pronouns and subordinating conjunctions. Together, those two are dependent marker words. They mark the beginning of a dependent clause. And here you can see the dependent clause, which is underlined. And the first word is that, which in this case is a dependent marker word initiating this clause here. And this entire clause is an adjectival dependent clause, which means it's a relative clause, and it's modifying this commandment. Which commandment are they talking about? The commandment that I command you today. So this is a dependent clause, it's adjectival in function, and therefore we call it a relative clause because it begins with a relative pronoun. Now, a dependent marker word, as I said, begins a dependent clause. And there are two kinds: subordinating conjunctions and relative pronouns. Here we have a verse of scripture with a dependent clause in it, which is underlined for you. And note the dependent marker word, which. And of course, that dependent marker word is beginning the dependent clause which God prepared beforehand. And you can see clearly that it's modifying this noun right here, works. They're good works, and they're works which God had prepared beforehand. Another relative clause here, beginning with a relative pronoun. You can see whom here is the relative pronoun. And you can see the dependent clause here because it's underlined. And this is an adjectival dependent clause. In other words, it's functioning as an adjective. Adjectives modify nouns. And this dependent clause is modifying this noun right here, brother. It's the brother whom we have often tested and found earnest in many matters. So that is a dependent clause with a relative pronoun. And again, a relative clause. And by the way, every time I say relative clause, it's the same exact thing as saying an adjectival dependent clause. Those two things are different words for the same thing. And here we have two dependent clauses, both of which begin with the dependent marker word whose, and that dependent marker word is a relative pronoun, and therefore we expect the clause to be adjectival. Here's a little clue that you should commit to memory. When a dependent marker word is a relative pronoun, it's very likely that that clause is going to be adjectival in function. It'll be modifying some noun. When a dependent marker word is a subordinating conjunction, then that dependent clause is likely to be adverbial. Look for the verb that it's modifying. That is a very important rule to remember in grammar, and we will review that again when we talk about subordinating conjunctions.